So we're still going to use ASI Expert to program the ASIC 3 controller, and the programming for all ASIC 3 controllers is essentially the same. They have the same programming options. The difference mainly is the number of I/O points, and then the 9540 has an extra local bus. But if you know how to program one ASIC 3, you essentially know how to program all ASIC 3s. And then there are a number of objects available in the controller, because ASIC 3, for the most part, is a graphical configuration tool. So you would drag out various icons that represent different types of objects and then link them together. Similar to wire sheet programming, if you've done that on a JACE. We have, and there's probably 50-ish different objects available. We're not going to learn about all of them today. There are some that you'll never use because they're specialized, or some are only for older controllers, but we'll learn about several of them today for sure. And so there's different objects like, input, output, logic. There's a sequence object, there's a PID object. So you'll drag out an icon to represent a specific instance of that object, because in the case of like inputs, on the 9540, there are 16 inputs. They're all handled by the input object. There's just different instances of the input object. And I think I mentioned on Monday that one thing you'll have to kind of get used to for the hardware points is that our objects, when you're programming the controller, they start counting from 0. So there's 16 inputs on a 9540, and they start from instance number 0 and go up to instance number 15, which is a little different. Most people would think that they'd be numbered 1 through 16. And in fact, on the cover for the 9540, they are actually labeled 1 through 16. And so you'll just have to, when you're doing panel drawings or programming the controller or anything like that, you'll just have to remember that what is labeled, I'll show you here on the picture, what's labeled as UI01 is actually input instance 0. What's labeled UI16 is actually input instance number 15. So it's a little weird at first. After you've done a few drawings or programmed a few controllers or whatever, I think it becomes pretty just intuitive, and you just do it subconsciously. So back to the slides. As I mentioned, there's multiple instances of the same object. For most objects, there are some specialized objects that there only is one possible instance. A couple examples of those would be like there's what we call the system object, and it only can have one instance. There's the clock object is another one that there's only one possible instance. I mentioned there's 48 objects in here. I think it's actually 51 now. There's 3 fairly new objects that are intended mainly for use with people that are using our controllers with Niagara products, with JACEs. And so we're not going to use any of those in our training class here. We do have documentation available if you are going to be doing some work with JACEs and need to use those. It's related to scheduling and notifications and I think calendars. So I mentioned some of the objects that we have, input, output, analog, output. Those are for the hardware points on the controller. There is an internal schedule, mainly for use in ASI protocol projects. And then there's a logic object that can do all sorts of logical comparisons, both binary and analog comparisons. So binary would be like, make sure 2 conditions are true, or 1 of 2 conditions are true. An analog comparison would be something like, is the temperature greater than a set point, or is the temperature equal to a set point, something like that. So we're going to still use ASI Expert as the programming tool for our ASIC 3 controllers. The screen is going to look a little bit differently, or going to look a little bit different. On the left side of the screen, when we programmed ASIC 1 controllers, the left side of the screen was always the controller tree. We saw the controllers that we had programmed in the tree. And then the right side of the screen was kind of the programming space. When connecting to an ASIC 3 controller, ASI Expert is going to use the entire screen to program the ASIC3. So the left side, you're going to see this Objects and Functions tab. We always start out on the Objects tab, and that shows us what objects are currently available in the controller. And there's a term we call allocation, where you can tell the controller which objects to make available and how many of each object, how many instances of each object to make available. Then to do the graphical programming, you switch over to the Functions tab. So this is just sort of a short step of things that you're going to want to do as you get started with your graphical programming. So first would be just to establish communication to the controller. You'll start out on the Objects tab, so you want to switch to the Functions tab to do the graphical programming. And then the screen will still be split into two sides. There's a narrower left sidebar, and then there's a programming space on the right. So if you right-click in the left pane, then you can select Add Group from the small menu that appears. And then you can name your group and start dragging icons out into the workspace on the right. There'll be an objects box that can kind of floats on the screen. It can be resized and repositioned. You just start dragging the various instances out that you think you need. You'll see some of this is an example of the icon for the output object, the binary output object. It's called the output object, but it's related to the relays on the controller. And sometimes you'll see this red circle with a slash through it, and that means that that instance is currently disabled. And so you'll want to enable any of the icons that are disabled, because when they are disabled, the controller essentially ignores them. It won't run the program in that, for that icon. And then you'll see various black squares either on the left or the right or both. And those are handle connections, which can be linked to other icons. So coming in from the left is an input to that icon. Coming out from the right is an output going to another icon. And so you right-click and drag from one black square to another. And so if you have, it'll be easier to do if you have an external mouse. It can be done certainly with a trackpad if you have a laptop, but it'll be easier if you have a mouse. And so the way you connect lines is with a right-click and drag. And so when you right-click and drag, the line will start with a red color. And then when you get ready to drop it on a valid landing point, then that line color will change from red to blue. You can then release the mouse button, and then those two icons will be linked together. You can then either right-click or double-click on an icon. If you double-click, it immediately goes into the Properties view. If you right-click, a menu will pop up, and you can select Properties at the bottom. And then you can go into that icon and set additional settings. In the case of like a schedule, you could set the on-off times. And so what we need to become proficient in terms of programming ASIC3 controllers, you'll need to learn what the various options are in terms of programming for the different types of objects, what the landing points do so you can connect them to the right point. And there's pretty good documentation that describes the functions of the various objects. And we'll refer to that documentation throughout the day. So just to get started, we're going to do just a very simple programming exercise, not really that practical because it's too simple. But we're just going to drag out a schedule, on a time of day schedule, and set some on and off times so that when the schedule's on, we turn on a relay. So we only need two icons, one for a schedule, one for the relay. We'll set the on-off times for each day, today being Wednesday. And when the time is between the on and the off time, then the schedule should turn on and the relay should turn on. So the schedules they're a little odd in our controllers in terms of the resolution. We saw in the ASIC ones, they have 15-minute resolution, so we could put in 7 a.m., 7:15 a.m., 7:30. In the ASIC 3, they're actually 7.5-minute increments. So we can put in 8 or 8:07, which is actually 8:07 and 30 seconds, and 8:15. And that has to do with when this object was originally designed, memory was much tighter in terms of total available memory in the controller. And so we chose that 7.5-minute increment way back when because it was a very kind of compact way to store time. If you do need to start something very specifically at 8:05, there's ways you can do that. You just would use the schedule object in conjunction with something like maybe the timer object. And there are some special cases. If you do 0 as the on time and 0 as the off time, like you see for Saturday, Sunday, and holiday, then that means the schedule will be off the entire day. And if the on time is 0 and the off time is 2400, then that means the schedule will be on the entire day. In terms of entering times, ASIC is pretty flexible, like I mentioned for the ASIC 1 controllers. So you can enter it in a variety of formats, but it will always display in 24-hour format for ASIC 3 controllers. So let's just do that as our programming example and make sure everybody can get connected to their controllers. So start ASI Expert if you haven't already. It looks like I haven't yet. So you should have version 3.8.0.39. That's the same version we installed on Monday. You should see the name of the project that you worked on for Monday. I think I called mine October 26th training. Is that right? I think so. Yeah. So October 26th training should have a little BACnet icon next to it. That means the little icon next to the project shows you the kind of communication path being used for that project. So the BAC is for BACnet communication. NET is for ASI protocol over Ethernet. And if you see like a little COM port cable, that's just a COM port connection. So open your BACnet project that you used on Monday. You should see the two controllers that you already connected to on Monday, but we want to connect our ASIC 3 controller now. So for BACnet projects, we have to initially do a discovery. And so it should remember the last way you connected. So it should have in the green bar here, it should say remote, same IP address that you see on my screen, 192.168.19.2, and the port number 47808. And so then you should be able to click who is, and then it should go out and try to discover ASI controllers on the BACnet network. And then we saw after discovery is complete, the who is button, while it's working, the who is text is gray. When it's done, the who is text changes from gray to black. And at that point, you can sort by the various columns. So there are a total of 18 controllers, 9502 through 9507, 18102 through 18107, and 116102 through 116107. I happen to miss 116104. I don't really need it, but if you are missing a controller, you want to make sure you see them all, you could click who is again. And you might have to do it a couple of times while we're all trying to discover at the same time, but eventually, if you want, you should see all 18 controllers. I'm missing a couple of VAVs there again. That looks like a longer list. 9502 through 7, 18102. So that's the total of 18 controllers. Was everybody at least able to discover 9502 through 9507? Everybody's muted if you're trying to let me know.
We're all good here.
Yes.
Everybody's good? Okay.
Yep.
So on Monday, I kind of assigned everybody a group of controllers. So Jason and Colin, are you using two? You are on two separate connections now, right? So Jason, you can do 9502. Colin, you can do 9503. Royce, I think you're sharing the computer with Corey, so you guys can do 9504. James, you can do 9506. And then I'm going to be 9505. So double click on the controller that I kind of assigned to you. And so in my case, I'm going to double click on 9505. So at that point, notice the product ID column was blank during initial discovery. Once you double click on it, then ASI Expert reaches out and tries to read a little bit more information from the controller. So that's where we see the model number, the ASI address, firmware version and description. And then in the communications profile, that's kind of the path to the controller. So it's using, basically we're putting ASI experts putting ASI programming messages into BACnet packets. And so it's kind of tunneling ASI protocol across BACnet. And so then it's showing us the IP address and the port number. BAC0 it's in hexadecimal format. It's the same as 47808. And then the device ID is the BACnet address. So once you are able to see the device profile for your ASIC 3 controller, you can click OK. And so here's the programming workspace. Right side looks pretty similar. There's tabs with color-coded parameters where some of them have green labels. Those are the ones that remain in the controller after reset. And there are ones with purple parameters, which are ones that usually don't change. And those are ones that the controller usually updates on its own. Here's the Objects and Functions tab I mentioned that you would see during the initial connection, where we start out on the Objects tab. And then here's the list of all the objects currently available in the controller. I mentioned that term called allocation that we can use if we want to make different objects available or change the number of instances that are available. I don't think we'll need to do that for our programming purposes today. And then you can switch to the Functions tab to do the graphical programming. So when we initially connected with the controller, ASI Expert just uploaded whatever information it needed for the opening display. And so once you click on the Functions tab, then it's going to read all the information out of the controller. And there is a, in most of the controllers, at least maybe one of them there might not be because I reprogrammed it, reset it a different way. This is just a simple program that I put in the controller to share the temperature between the two ASIC ones. So you can kind of that one's not that important right now. But going back to the slides, we're going to just add a group so that we can put these two icons on the screen. So what the slide said to do is go to the left side of the screen underneath the Functions tab and just right click and a menu pops up. You then want to click on Add Group to add a new programming group and then give that group a name. And I'll call it something like fan control. The function group names can have letters and numbers and spaces, dash and underscore, and I tend to avoid all punctuation beyond that. Certain punctuation can get a little confusing within Windows, like dots and slashes and stuff like that. So letters, numbers, spaces, dashes, underscores is safe. So fan control is my new name. I click OK. The names sort alphabetically once you have multiple functions. And then here's that floating objects box. So it can be repositioned, it can be resized. Most people tend to put it, from what I've seen, in the lower left corner, kind of below their functions. Doesn't have to be, but that's where I'll put mine. And so then there's this drop-down menu at the bottom of the screen, or at the top of the window. And it will show an alphabetical listing of all the objects. And so then you would click on an object to see what instances are available, and then you drag one of those instances on the screen so that you'll get an icon for that instance. So I'll scroll down and find SCH for schedule. I have 4 schedules currently available in the controller, instance numbers 0 through 3. Most people, and I think it seems logical, tend to work from the top and work their way down. So I'll start with schedule instance 0, drag it on the screen, I get a little red icon. Then I'll go back to the objects box, find OUT for output. And then here's a case where I see those instance numbers 0 through 15 corresponding to relay 1 through relay 16. So if my fan was the first relay, I'd find output instance 0, drag it on the screen, and get a green icon. And then here's the black landing point, the handle connections. The schedule doesn't actually have any input handles, but in the top right corner of the schedule icon, there's a landing point labeled PV which is the present value of the schedule. And that present value is 0 when the schedule's off, and it's some non-zero value when the schedule's on. On the output icon in the top left corner, there's a square labeled VAL. We call that the output value handle. And so the output is actually looking back at some other condition in the controller, and when it sees a 0, it turns off. When it sees a non-zero value, then it wants to turn on. So the present value of the schedule and the output value handle, those go well together. So to connect them, you can right-click and drag from one black square to another, and whether you go left to right or right to left, it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to right-click, and you have to be on the black landing point. So I'll go to the PV square on the schedule, right-click and drag. There's the red line. I'll go find VAL for the output. When I get close there, you see the line color change to blue. I hear a little bell ring. And then when I release the mouse button, then those two icons are linked together with that blue line. Does everybody have those two icons linked together now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good deal. Again, if you have any questions, certainly just let me know. Just unmute and let me know, or you could also just type something in chat. I'll occasionally peek down and see if there's anything in the chat window. So then if you go to the schedule properties, either with a right-click properties or double-click, I tend to do right-click properties because sometimes when I'm double-clicking, I move my mouse a little bit in between clicks, and that causes the icon to move a little bit. So I've gotten in the habit of right-click properties. If you can double-click without moving your pointer, then that might be a little quicker. So then here's the properties of that schedule. Most icons in the top left, it gives you a name for the icon, what we call the instance name. So for the schedule, I could give it a more descriptive name like fan schedule. And then in the upper right corner, I can see the time in the controller and the date. So ASIC 3s have full time date awareness. So it thinks it's Wednesday, October 28th, 2020 at 7:56 a.m., which is Pacific time. So if I go to my Wednesday schedule and say we started at 7:30 Pacific time, for Wednesday on, I can click on the current time, which is 0 is valid in the ASIC 3 schedule. 0 represents midnight at the beginning of the day. So I'll type in 7:30. I don't need the colons. I can put them in if I want, but they're not needed. And then if we were to finish by 1:30 p.m. Pacific time today, for the Wednesday off time, I could either type 1:30 p or 13:30. Either way will work fine. It will always display it in 24-hour format, though. So the present value then, once I've entered an on time before the current time and an off time after the current time, then the present value of the schedule turns on. And so to get back to the graphical programming view, you can just click on the name of your group. In this case, mine is called fan control. It's in bold text. And then I can see where that was a 0 and which caused the output to turn off. Now I see it's not 0. It's this 65535 number, which caused the output to turn on. Did everybody get their output to turn on due to the schedule change?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
In terms of the lines between the controllers, you don't have any direct control. You can't change where the line breaks. It kind of just breaks halfway in between. You can reposition your icons in such a way, to get the appearance that you want. And then you can use the arrow keys on your keyboard if you want to make the line, move the icon 1 pixel in any direction. Just use the arrow keys on your keyboard. So if you want to get that line perfectly straight, you should be able to. There's not a lot to look at in the properties on the output, but one thing I can do there is change its name. So if I go to the green output icon and do a right-click properties, then I can give my binary output a name like fan. There are some settings in here I could consider changing, like I could enable the minimum on-off feature so that when it turns on, it stays on for at least the cycle min on time, and when it turns off, it stays off for at least the cycle min off time. If it's unchecked and no, then there are no minimum on and off times. So that's just a simple exercise just to get you used to dragging icons out from the objects box, connecting lines, viewing properties. So we'll be doing a lot of that today, and we'll make